You shuffle out of bed, the straw mattress rustling beneath you. The air in your small, one-room dwelling smells faintly of wood smoke and something vaguely agricultural. Maybe the pig got a little too close to the door again. Breakfast isn't a question of what you want, but what you have. Today, it's a hunk of dark, coarse bread that's probably a few days old, its crust stubbornly resisting your teeth. If you're lucky, there's a small knob of hard cheese, likely made from sheep's milk and possessing a flavor that can best be described as assertive. You wash it down with some water from the nearby stream, hoping it's not too lively. No fancy coffee, no freshly squeezed orange juice, certainly no elaborate smoothie bowls. This is the reality for most people in medieval times. Food is fuel, and often not particularly enjoyable fuel at that. Your days are filled with hard labor, whether it's toiling in the fields, tending livestock, or crafting goods. All that work requires energy, but the meals you consume are often lacking in variety and nutritional balance. Imagine trying to power through a 10-hour workday on a diet that consists mainly of grains and whatever vegetables you can cultivate in your small plot. Meat is a rare luxury for most, appearing perhaps a few times a year during festivals or after a successful hunt. Forget about popping down to the local butcher for a nicely marbled steak. If you eat meat, you've likely raised the animal yourself, witnessed its processing, and will be making it last for as long as humanly possible. Think about the simple act of making bread. You wouldn't just stroll to the bakery. It would involve grinding your own grain, a laborious task in itself, mixing it with water, perhaps some wild yeast if you're skilled, and then baking it over an open fire or in a communal oven. The result is often dense and heavy, a far cry from the fluffy loaves you might pick up at the supermarket. And don't even get started on the concept of organic or gluten-free. Those are modern worries. In medieval times, you were just hoping your bread wasn't moldy or infested with weevils. The lack of readily available and diverse food sources meant that your diet was largely dictated by the seasons and what you could produce locally. Winter was a particularly lean time, with preserved foods like salted meat and root vegetables forming the bulk of your sustenance. You'd likely be dreaming of the fresh greens and fruits that would return with the spring. We moderns, accustomed to year-round availability of almost any food we desire, can barely fathom this level of dependence on the agricultural cycle. Imagine your entire culinary world shrinking to what grows within a few miles of your home. No exotic fruits, no imported delicacies, just the humble bounty or lack thereof of your local environment. It's a far cry from scrolling through endless options on a food delivery app, isn't it? Now, let's peek behind the castle wall, shall we? You might be picturing King Arthur and his knights feasting on roasted boar and overflowing goblets of wine. And while grand banquets certainly happened, the daily fare for even the nobility wasn't always the picture of culinary perfection you might imagine. Sure, they had more access to meat, venison from the hunt, poultry raised on their lands, perhaps even some imported delicacies if they were wealthy enough. But the preparation and the overall taste might still surprise your modern palate. Think about a typical noble meal. It would likely feature a large quantity of meat, often roasted whole and presented with a certain theatrical flair. But the seasoning might be surprisingly subdued. Salt was available to the wealthy, but other spices were still expensive and used sparingly. Imagine a huge joint of beef cooked over an open fire with maybe just a sprinkle of herbs and a generous amount of salt. It's a far cry from the complex marinades and spice rubs we enjoy today. Sauces existed, but they were often thick, based on breadcrumbs or animal organs, and could be quite intense in flavor. The Norman conquest in 1066 had a significant impact on English cuisine, introducing new ingredients and cooking techniques. Think about the influence of French culinary traditions, bringing in things like game meats and more elaborate sauces. However, even with these advancements, the emphasis was often on quantity over subtlety. A display of wealth often meant having a table laden with food, even if much of it wasn't particularly refined. Consider a royal banquet. It would be a spectacle, a demonstration of power and status. Dishes might include roasted swans or peacocks, elaborately decorated pies, and sweet concoctions made with honey. But beneath the grandeur, the actual taste might not have been as impressive as the presentation. Imagine biting into a roasted swine. The meat is likely to be tough and gamey, a far cry from a tender chicken breast. And those elaborate pies? They might contain a strange mix of meats, fruits, and spices that wouldn't necessarily appeal to modern sensibilities. Even the beverages weren't always what you might expect. Wine was the drink of the nobility, but its quality could vary wildly. It might be strong, acidic, or even a bit funky by today's standards. Ale was also consumed, and again, the brewing process was less controlled, resulting in a drink that could be quite different from the beers you find in your local pub. So, while the nobles certainly ate better than the peasants, their food wasn't necessarily a gourmet experience. It was often heavy, heavily reliant on meat, and sometimes surprisingly bland. The emphasis was on showing off wealth and abundance rather than achieving delicate flavors and textures. You might find yourself at a medieval royal feast surrounded by opulence and still secretly craving a simple, well-seasoned burger. The irony wouldn't be lost on you. Now, let's talk about flavor, or rather, the distinct lack thereof in much of medieval cuisine. Imagine your kitchen spice rack. You probably have a dozen or more different jars and containers, each holding aromatic wonders from around the globe. Pepper from India, chili flakes from South America, fragrant basil from the Mediterranean. In medieval times, your spice rack would likely be bare. Salt was the primary seasoning, essential not only for taste, but also for preserving food. Beyond that, options were limited and often incredibly expensive. Think about pepper. Today, it's so ubiquitous, we barely give it a second thought. You sprinkle it on your eggs, your pasta, your salad. In the Middle Ages, pepper was a luxury item, often worth more than its weight in silver. It had to travel vast distances from its origins in India, passing through numerous traders and incurring hefty taxes along the way. Only the wealthiest could afford to use it regularly, and even then, it was often used sparingly, a symbol of status as much as a flavor enhancer. Other spices like cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and ginger were even more exotic and costly. These came from the distant East, their journey shrouded in mystery and their prices inflated by middlemen. Imagine a medieval cook carefully grating a tiny amount of precious nutmeg into a dish, knowing that this single spice could represent a significant portion of their household's wealth. It's a far cry from reaching for the jar of pre-ground nutmeg in your pantry. Local herbs like parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme were available to some extent, but their use wasn't always widespread, and their flavor profiles are relatively mild compared to many of the spices we use today. Imagine trying to create a vibrant, flavorful curry using only parsley and a pinch of salt. It wouldn't quite hit the mark, would it? The lack of spices had a profound impact on the taste of medieval food. Meats could be bland, vegetables uninspired, and even sweet dishes lacked the complex aromatic notes we've come to expect. To compensate, medieval cooks sometimes relied on techniques like long, slow cooking or the use of acidic ingredients like vinegar or verjus, the juice of unripe grapes, to add some tanginess. But these methods couldn't replicate the depth and complexity that spices provide. Consider the impact on trade. The demand for spices fueled exploration and the development of trade routes that eventually connected the East and West. Think about the voyages of discovery, driven in part by the desire to find new and cheaper sources of these precious flavorings. It's fascinating to realize that something as simple as pepper played a role in shaping world history. So, the next time you reach for your spice rack, take a moment to appreciate the incredible variety of flavors at your fingertips. Imagine a world where most food tasted, well, kind of the same. It certainly puts a new perspective on the simple act of seasoning, doesn't it? You'd probably find yourself hoarding those little packets of extra pepper from takeout containers like they were gold. Now, let's talk about keeping food from going, well, bad. Imagine opening your refrigerator and finding it empty. That's essentially the reality of medieval life. Without refrigeration, preserving food was a constant battle against the relentless march of spoilage. The primary methods available were salting, smoking, and pickling, and each of these techniques dramatically altered the taste and texture of the original ingredients. Forget about the vibrant colors and fresh flavors you expect from your produce and meats. Think about meat preservation. Fresh meat would only last for a few days at most, depending on the weather. To make it last longer, it would be heavily salted, drawing out moisture and inhibiting bacterial growth. Imagine biting into a piece of salted beef. It would be tough, dry, and intensely salty, a far cry from a juicy, tender steak. Smoking was another common method, exposing the meat to smoke from a fire, which helped to dry it out and impart a smoky flavor. Again, this process significantly changed the texture and taste. Fish, being even more perishable than meat, also underwent similar preservation processes. Salted herring was a staple for many, but it would have a strong, pungent flavor that might not appeal to modern palates. Imagine a diet where much of the protein you consumed was either rock hard and salty or had a distinctly smoky aroma. Vegetables and fruits also presented preservation challenges. Pickling in vinegar or brine was a common method, transforming crisp cucumbers into sour pickles and firm beans into tangy preserves. Drying was another option, turning juicy plums into chewy prunes and vibrant apples into leathery slices. While these methods allowed people to store food for longer periods, they also meant that the taste and texture were drastically different from their fresh counterparts. Imagine a winter diet consisting largely of salted meat, pickled vegetables, and dried fruit. It wouldn't exactly be a culinary adventure. Consider the impact on cooking. Medieval recipes often had to take these preservation methods into account. For example, salted meat might need to be soaked for hours to remove some of the excess salt before it could be cooked. The strong flavors of preserved foods also influenced the way dishes were seasoned, or not seasoned, as we discussed. There were also regional variations in preservation techniques. For example, in colder climates, freezing could be used to store food during the winter months, although this was obviously dependent on the weather. Fermentation was another method used for some foods, like cabbage being transformed into sauerkraut. The constant struggle to preserve food also meant that waste was something to be avoided at all costs. Every part of an animal would be used, and stale bread might be turned into breadcrumbs or used to thicken sauces. Nothing was taken for granted. So, the next time you casually toss a piece of slightly wilted lettuce into the bin, spare a thought for the medieval housewife who would have done everything possible to make it last. The lack of refrigeration shaped not only what people ate, but also how they lived and cooked. It was a world where the simple act of keeping food edible was a daily challenge. Now, imagine your local supermarket suddenly vanished. Poof, gone. Where would you get your next meal? For many in medieval times, the answer was right outside their doorstep, the wild. Foraging for edible plants, nuts, berries, and mushrooms was a crucial skill, supplementing meager harvests and sometimes providing the only food available. But this wasn't the idyllic, Instagram-filtered image of gathering wild herbs you might have in your head. It was often a risky endeavor, fraught with the potential for poisoning or simply coming up empty-handed. Think about the knowledge required. You'd need to be able to distinguish between edible and poisonous plants, a skill passed down through generations. Imagine the consequences of misidentification. A stomachache could be the least of your worries. Deadly nightshade, hemlock, and various toxic fungi lurked in the undergrowth, waiting to be mistaken for something nutritious.
There were no handy field guides with color photographs. Your survival depended on ingrained knowledge and careful observation. Even familiar-looking plants could have poisonous lookalikes. Imagine the anxiety of picking berries, constantly wondering if you'd accidentally grab something that could make you violently ill or worse. This wasn't a leisurely stroll in the woods, it was a matter of life and death. Beyond the risk of poisoning, there was also the challenge of seasonality and availability. Different plants ripened at different times of the year, and a patch that was abundant one week might be barren the next. Imagine relying on wild berries to add some sweetness to your otherwise bland diet, only to find that the birds had gotten there first, or that the weather had ruined the crop. Competition was another factor. You weren't the only one relying on the bounty of the wild. Animals also foraged for food, and you might find yourself competing with squirrels for nuts or birds for berries. Imagine the frustration of spotting a promising patch of wild garlic, only to discover that a herd of deer had already grazed through it. There were also legal restrictions in some areas. Forests were often owned by nobles, and poaching, taking anything from the land without permission, including plants, could result in severe penalties. Imagine risking a beating or even imprisonment just to gather a few handfuls of wild mushrooms to feed your family. However, when successful, foraging could provide valuable nutrients and variety to the medieval diet. Wild greens offered vitamins and minerals often lacking in grain-heavy meals. Nuts provided fats and protein. Berries added a touch of sweetness. Imagine the relief of finding a patch of wild strawberries, a rare burst of flavor in an otherwise monotonous culinary landscape. Historians are still debating whether the average medieval person had a detailed knowledge of wild foods or if foraging was primarily done out of desperation during times of scarcity. It likely varied depending on location, social status, and the availability of cultivated crops. In some communities, wild plants may have been a regular part of the diet, while in others, they were only relied upon when harvests failed. So the next time you consider a farm-to-table meal, remember that for many in the Middle Ages, it was more of a forest-to-table existence, with all the inherent risks and uncertainties that came with it. You might think a modern foraging course is a fun weekend activity, but for your medieval ancestors, it was often a crucial element of survival.
Now, let's talk about what people were washing down their often questionable meals with. You might automatically reach for a glass of clean, filtered water, but in medieval times, water wasn't always the safest bet. Rivers and wells could be easily contaminated with sewage and other pollutants, leading to the spread of waterborne diseases that you definitely wouldn't want to experience. Imagine taking a refreshing gulp of water only to unknowingly ingest bacteria that could cause serious illness. Not exactly thirst-quenching, is it? This is why ale and wine were often the preferred beverages, even for children. The fermentation process involved in making these drinks killed off many of the harmful microorganisms, making them safer to consume than untreated water. Think about it. A mild buzz might have been a small price to pay for avoiding dysentery. Ale, a type of beer made with malted grains, was a staple drink throughout much of medieval Europe, particularly in areas where grapes didn't grow well. It wasn't the clear, often hop-heavy beer you might be familiar with today. Medieval ale was often cloudier, less alcoholic, and flavored with a variety of herbs and spices rather than predominantly hops. Imagine a slightly murky, somewhat sweet, and subtly herby drink being a daily beverage for everyone in the family. Wine, on the other hand, was more prevalent in Southern Europe, where grapes flourished. Its quality could vary enormously, from the fine wines enjoyed by the nobility to the sour, vinegary stuff that was common among the lower classes. Imagine the disappointment of expecting a rich, fruity wine and getting something that tasted more like diluted vinegar. Monasteries played a significant role in the production of both ale and wine. They often had the resources and the knowledge to brew and ferment on a larger scale and to maintain higher standards of quality. Think about the monks carefully tending their vineyards or meticulously overseeing the brewing process, contributing significantly to the availability of relatively safe beverages. However, even ale and wine weren't always consistent.
Brewing and winemaking were less scientific processes than they are today, relying more on tradition and experience. This meant that the taste and strength of a batch could vary widely. Imagine one day your ale is mild and refreshing, and the next it's surprisingly potent or has a distinctly off flavor. Quality control wasn't exactly a medieval strong suit. Other beverages existed, though they were less common. Cider, made from fermented apples, was popular in some regions. Mead, a drink made from fermented honey and water, was also consumed, though often it was more of a luxury item due to the cost of honey. Milk was available, but it didn't keep for long without refrigeration and could also be a source of bacteria if not handled properly. So, the next time you turn on the tap and enjoy a glass of clear, clean water, take a moment to appreciate this modern convenience. In medieval times, something as simple as staying hydrated could be a risky proposition, leading people to rely on fermented drinks that, while safer, might not have been the most palatable options by today's standards. You might find yourself secretly wishing for a nice cold glass of iced tea, even if it meant risking the local well water.
Now, let's move from the often bland reality of daily medieval food to the terrifying specter that haunted communities: famine. While some periods saw relative abundance, the Middle Ages were punctuated by devastating periods of widespread starvation. Imagine the gnawing hunger, the weakness, the sheer desperation that gripped entire populations when crops failed. It wasn't just about missing a meal. It was about the very real threat of death for yourself and your family. Crop failures were the primary cause of famine. These could be triggered by a variety of factors: prolonged droughts, excessive rainfall leading to floods and waterlogged fields, early frosts that destroyed harvests before they could ripen, and outbreaks of plant diseases like blight. Imagine watching your carefully tended fields wither and die, knowing that your survival depended on that harvest. The feeling of helplessness must have been overwhelming. One of the most infamous examples is the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. This was a period of intense and prolonged bad weather across northern Europe. Imagine relentless rain for months on end, ruining crops and making it impossible to plant new ones. Livestock died from disease and lack of fodder. Food prices soared to unimaginable levels, putting them far out of reach for the majority of the population. People were reduced to eating anything they could find: roots, bark, even grass. There were even horrifying accounts of cannibalism in the most desperate situations. The impact of famine went far beyond just hunger. Malnutrition weakened people's immune systems, making them more susceptible to disease. Epidemics often followed in the wake of famine, further decimating the population. Imagine surviving the initial starvation only to succumb to a fever or plague because your body was too weak to fight it off. Famine also had profound social and economic consequences. It could lead to widespread social unrest as desperate people turned to theft and violence in their search for food. Trade networks were disrupted, and the economy could be crippled for years. Imagine the breakdown of order as communities struggled to survive. The medieval agricultural system was particularly vulnerable to these kinds of crises. Farming techniques were less advanced than today, and there was limited understanding of soil science or pest control. Reliance on local harvests meant that a regional weather event could have catastrophic consequences. There were no efficient transportation networks to bring in food from unaffected areas on a large scale. Imagine the isolation of a village facing starvation with no hope of outside help arriving in time. Even in less extreme times, food shortages could occur, particularly in the late winter and early spring before the new crops came in. This period, sometimes called the lean season, could be a time of hardship and hunger for many. Imagine the relief when the first signs of spring appeared, promising the eventual return of fresh food.
So, the next time you have a minor inconvenience with your grocery delivery, remember the stark reality of famine in the Middle Ages. It was a recurring nightmare that shaped the lives and fears of millions. The constant threat of starvation was a dark undercurrent to everyday life, a stark reminder of the fragility of existence when your next meal wasn't guaranteed. You might find yourself a little more grateful for the abundance and security of the modern food system.
Now, let's delve into some of the more peculiar items that might have found their way onto a medieval table. Prepare yourself, because some of these might sound a little strange to your modern sensibilities. Forget your perfectly portioned, aesthetically pleasing meals for a moment, and imagine a world where resourcefulness and a different understanding of food led to some rather unusual culinary practices. Think about the variety of meats that were consumed. While pork, beef, and lamb were common, the medieval diet also included things like game birds, swans, herons, and even animals that you might consider more as pests today, such as hedgehogs or squirrels. Imagine sitting down to a roasted hedgehog, prickly skin and all, or a pie filled with various small birds. The texture and flavor profiles would be quite different from what you're used to. Animal organs were also a common part of the diet, often out of necessity to avoid waste. Things like liver, kidneys, and intestines were used in various dishes. Imagine a stew made with tripe, the stomach lining of cows or sheep. It has a very distinct texture and flavor that can be acquired. Medieval cooks also had a penchant for combining sweet and savory flavors in ways that might seem odd today. Imagine a meat pie filled with dried fruit, or a fish dish served with a sweet sauce. These combinations, while perhaps surprising, reflected the limited availability of distinct sweet courses and a different approach to balancing flavors. Consider the use of gelatinous substances. Dishes thickened with isinglass, a type of gelatin made from fish bladders, were popular, particularly for elaborate molded dishes served at banquets. Imagine a shimmering, wobbly concoction made from fish bladders, not exactly the appetizing image that comes to mind when you think of dessert. There were also some interesting beliefs surrounding food. For example, certain foods were thought to have medicinal properties, and dietary recommendations were often based on the prevailing medical theories of the time, which could be quite different from modern nutritional science. Imagine being told to eat a particular herb to balance your humors based on a theory that has long since been debunked. Historians are still debating whether some of the more extreme recipes found in medieval cookbooks were actually consumed regularly or were more for show or symbolic purposes. Elaborate dishes featuring multiple types of animals stuffed inside each other, like the legendary cockatrice, a mythical creature made from the top half of a pig and the bottom half of a capon, might have been more fantastical creations for special occasions rather than everyday meals. Even something as simple as milk could be viewed differently. While consumed, it wasn't always considered the pure and wholesome food we think of today. Concerns about hygiene and preservation meant that it was often used in cooked dishes rather than drunk fresh. So, the next time you wrinkle your nose at a particular food trend, remember that culinary history is full of surprises. The medieval palate was shaped by different circumstances, beliefs, and available ingredients, leading to some dishes that might seem downright bizarre to us today. You might find yourself a little more adventurous with your own food after contemplating the culinary oddities of the Middle Ages. Now, let's look at the slow but steady progress in food production and availability as the Middle Ages drew to a close. While life was still tough for many and the specter of famine hadn't entirely vanished, gradual improvements in agricultural techniques and expanding trade networks began to bring some diversification to the medieval diet. Imagine the subtle shifts occurring over centuries, little by little making life and eating slightly less monotonous. Think about advancements in farming.
The development and wider adoption of the heavy plow, for example, allowed for the cultivation of heavier, more fertile soils in northern Europe, leading to increased grain production. The three-field system, where land was divided into three parts with different crops rotated each year, helped to improve soil fertility and reduce the risk of total crop failure. Imagine these innovations, seemingly small in isolation, collectively contributing to a more reliable food supply. The growth of trade also played a crucial role. As towns and cities expanded, so did markets and the exchange of goods. While spices remained expensive, they became slightly more accessible to a wider range of people. New fruits and vegetables, perhaps previously only grown in certain regions, began to appear in local markets. Imagine the excitement of encountering a new type of fruit that had traveled from a distant land, a rare treat that added a bit of novelty to the usual fare. The development of better roads and waterways, though still rudimentary by modern standards, facilitated the movement of goods, including food. Coastal towns and those located along rivers had greater access to a wider variety of stuffs. Imagine the bustling docks where boats laden with fish, salt, and other provisions arrived, bringing new possibilities to the local diet. Changes in social structures also had an impact. As some peasants gained more freedom and wealth, they might have had more opportunities to diversify their own small holdings and perhaps even sell surplus produce in local markets. Imagine a farmer being able to grow a wider range of vegetables and even keep a few more animals, leading to a slightly more varied diet for their family. The rise of a merchant class also contributed to culinary changes. As people engaged in trade and accumulated wealth, their tastes became more refined, and they had the means to purchase more diverse and higher quality foods. Imagine the emergence of specialized food vendors in towns, offering things like cheeses, cured meats, and baked goods. However, it's important to remember that these changes were gradual and uneven. The vast majority of the population, particularly in rural areas, still relied heavily on locally produced food and experienced a diet that was relatively limited compared to what we enjoy today. Imagine the stark contrast between the well-stocked pantry of a wealthy merchant in a bustling city and the simple stores of a peasant in a remote village. Even towards the end of the Middle Ages, food preservation remained a significant challenge, and famine was still a threat in many areas. But the slow accumulation of agricultural knowledge, the expansion of trade, and evolving social structures were laying the groundwork for the more diverse and abundant food systems that would emerge in later centuries. So, the next time you visit a farmer's market with its colorful array of fresh produce from different regions, remember that this abundance is the result of centuries of slow progress. The medieval world was gradually inching towards a more varied and reliable food supply, one small step at a time. You might find yourself appreciating the interconnectedness of our modern food system even more when you consider its long and often challenging evolution.
Now, as our boring journey through medieval food draws to a close, let's take a moment to reflect on just how different things were. Imagine stepping out of your time machine, blinking in the dim light of a medieval dwelling, and being offered a piece of that tough, unsalted bread and a sip of potentially dodgy ale. You'd probably politely decline and start desperately scanning for the nearest pizza delivery app. The sheer limitations and uncertainties of the medieval food system stand in stark contrast to the abundance and variety we take for granted today. Think back to the daily grind of obtaining and preparing food. The back-breaking labor in the fields, the constant worry about spoilage, the limited options for seasoning, the very real fear of starvation. It paints a picture of a life where food was not just sustenance, but a central preoccupation, a constant challenge that shaped daily routines and anxieties. Consider the sensory experience. The often bland tastes, the coarse textures, the sometimes unpleasant smells of preserved foods. It's a far cry from the explosion of flavors and aromas that characterize modern cuisine. Imagine a world where a truly sweet or spicy dish was a rare and treasured experience. We moderns have the luxury of choice.
We can decide what we want to eat based on our cravings, our dietary preferences, or simply what looks good on a menu. Medieval people ate what was available, what they could grow or gather, and what they could afford. The concept of a foodie indulging in exotic flavors and culinary adventures would have been utterly alien to them. Even the simplest aspects of our food culture, the ease of refrigeration, the availability of clean drinking water, the global trade networks that bring us ingredients from every corner of the world, were absent in medieval times. Imagine a summer without ice cream or a dinner without black pepper. These small inconveniences highlight the vast gulf between their world and ours. Looking back at the oddities on the medieval table, the reliance on foraged foods, and the constant threat of famine, we can perhaps gain a new appreciation for the security and diversity of our modern food system. While we may complain about food prices or the latest diet trends, the fundamental availability and safety of our food are something that our medieval ancestors could only have dreamed of. So, as you settle back into your comfortable surroundings, perhaps with a snack within easy reach, take a moment to be grateful for the culinary world we inhabit. It's a world of flavors, textures, and choices that would have seemed like a fantastical dream to someone living in the Middle Ages. And maybe, just maybe, the next time you consider ordering takeout, you'll spare a thought for the days when your biggest culinary decision was whether to eat the slightly moldy bread or risk foraging for something potentially poisonous in the woods.